which I know I pronounced in perfect Dutch. Studium Generale sharpens your mind and expands your horizons with innovative and multidisciplinary activities on science, culture, and society. Check out sggroningen.nl, there it is, to stay updated on lectures, films, debates, and more. I'm Ann Martinez. I'm the convener of the Americas Research Collective, which has brought Mike Foley here for a few days, and with support from the US Embassy. And we're happy to partner with Studium Generale tonight for this lecture, part of the Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About series, which is being revived tonight with this lecture about Johnny Cash. And now to our speaker. Michael Stewart Foley is a prolific author, writing extensively about American political culture in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, especially around the political activism and concerns of everyday people. In recent years, Foley has turned his attention to music, writing about Dead Kennedys, Rahsaan Roland Kirk, and Johnny Cash, as well as writing for broader audiences through The Guardian, Boston Globe, and the Daily Beast. Foley is an activist scholar who has written and organized towards the closure of Guantanamo, an ongoing effort, and now works for Farm Aid, founded by musician Willie Nelson, which promotes good food, family farms, and political action in support of more sustainable family farming. And I'm sure Mike would be happy to take questions about that as well later. His most recent book, Citizen Cash, The Political Life and Times of Johnny Cash, is the basis for his talk this evening. The book was widely reviewed in both academic and popular worlds when it came out 2 years ago. One reviewer wrote, "Most of us remember Cash as a country music star, a celebrity who projected a loner outlaw persona. Foley has done an excellent teardown of that image by focusing on a key virtue of Cash, his immense empathy for the underdog." Another reader wrote, "Foley beautifully combines historical biography with his knowledge of Cash's music and its context. This is a masterful work." The Spanish language version of the book is just out, bringing Mike's incisive analysis to an even broader audience. Please join me in welcoming Mike Foley back to Groningen, where he served as a professor of American Studies from 2013 to 2016.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out in the weather. I know you're used to it. It doesn't faze you. After I worked here, I moved to southern France, where I taught at the University of Grenoble, and one drop of rain was enough to scare people off from a talk like this. So I appreciate it. I appreciate Studium Generale and the Americas Research Collective and the US Embassy for bringing me here at this time of year where I got to have the full Dutch experience today, riding in my bike, messing up my hair. I kind of missed that. I also got my fill of kibbling earlier today, so I'm like living the dream, you know? And I am truly grateful for all of my hosts for bringing me, because it may seem easy enough to bring someone to come speak to an audience from the United States, but having tried it unsuccessfully many times myself, I could tell you it's a lot of work. So many thanks to Anne, to Annelies, to Ava, wherever she is, for helping to make it happen. Right, so today I'm presenting part of the book that Anne held up. It's now in Spanish, not yet in Dutch, because you speak English too well. So the publisher figures it's not worth translating it into Dutch. I have argued about this, but I have not won. In one part, I'm basically presenting one chapter from this book. That's the book right there, which is a political biography. I see it's doing a weird thing here, not there. Is that normal? Okay. All right, I won't freak out. So the point of the book is that, you know, if you're I sense you're probably pretty familiar with Johnny Cash, and there's a lot that's been written about him, right, but not so much about his politics. And so this book is very specifically not a typical biography of Cash, but a political biography that covers many different political issues across the period where he was kind of reaching the top of his influence, cultural influence in the United States from primarily the 1960s and 70s, right? And in the book, I make a case for Cash, in fact, being one of the United States' most prominent political artists in the same period, the 60s and 70s. And that seems a little counterintuitive because he didn't practice a kind of politics that is as easily recognized, right, as participating in political campaigns, right, or coming out kind of more strongly on one issue or another. I was saying to a friend earlier today that in the US, perhaps like here, right, the media likes very simple labels about political experience. So it's all left and right, right? It's liberals and conservatives. It's red states and blue states. And anything in between is not very interesting to the mainstream media, and so doesn't wind up being part of the political discourse. So part of my motivation for writing the book was that the media loves to say now that the United States is living through a period of polarization that's unparalleled, which of course is ridiculous because there was a civil war once in the 1860s, and I would say that was when it was at its most divided and polarized. But also during the period of the Vietnam War, pundits were all the time saying that the United States had never been so polarized, right? So I'm interested in how Cash kind of navigated his public presentation of himself and his work in this period of polarization. And instead of trying to categorize him, I created a new category of saying that he practiced the kind of politics of empathy, right? And now empathy, I feel like in the last couple of years, not because of me, but has become like much more prominent in political discussions in the United States. I mean it very specifically, like that it was, his politics were driven by, very much by his own experiences, right? Kind of the promptings of his own experiences. His emotional reaction to very specific issues, whichever issue we're talking about, and that he channeled through a sensibility of a social realist artist, right? And at the time in the United States, the most obvious social realist examples were photographers, right? Like in the Great Depression era is kind of the heyday of social realism in the United States. So these are two photos, one by Dorothea Lange and the other by Walker Evans, taken in the 1930s. And Cash, as I'll talk a little bit about here tonight, when I focus primarily on race, right, on Cash's engagement with African Americans, the Black experience, the civil rights movement, is driven very much by his own experience, his empathy for others, and in particular, this social realist sensibility, right, that's going to come out in the art that he produces at the time. So if you've read any of the other biographies of Cash or scholarly studies that came out since he died in 2003, you know that his politics are usually described as contradictory, right, or paradoxical, because they don't fit into those categories, so then there must be something wrong with him, right? He must be a paradox or a contradiction. And that in particular, no attention has been given to Cash and his stands on civil rights, which is weird because, as I say, he comes to prominence in the 1960s at exactly the same time that the civil rights movement is dominating American political life, right? Most people seem to accept the criticism that some commentators directed at him at the time in the late 60s, when he was well known as an advocate for Native American rights and for prison reform. for failing to speak up for the black community. And Cash did not help himself when he responded to one journalist by saying that he had never, quote, said anything in print about black people because no one's ever asked me. Surely that could not have been true as late as 1970, when he's like a superstar, right, of American music and arts. He said, "I can tell you that I think they're not getting a fair shake," like he's trying to recover, but he said, "The only reason I haven't written a song about their problems is that the inspiration never came to me, and I've never been given any good material on the subject, but I am sympathetic to colored people and their problems, and there are a lot of things about the Southern whites that I'm ashamed of." Those comments are usually the most that you ever read about Johnny Cash and race, even though he was, like I say, from 1969 to 1971, when he had a weekly television show on national television, arguably the most prominent political artist of his time. So what I found out as I got deeper into the research, and I should say, like at the beginning, I also bought this line that he hadn't said much about civil rights. And I wasn't even going to write a whole chapter on it. I was going to write a chapter mostly on his interest in Native Americans, and I was going to fold in what little we had on civil rights. But as I got more deeply into it, particularly by watching every single episode of the television show, which was his primary platform for engaging the American public on social and political issues, it became clear that Cash had not ignored race at all. In fact, it became clear that his engagement with race was central to his whole political persona, to what I'm calling this politics of empathy. So, for example, I begin the chapter, which is, I think, chapter 3 of the book, by describing an appearance on the Johnny Cash Show in August of 1969. So this is in the very first, it's not even guaranteed that he's going to have more than one season. He gets a short season as a kind of trial run, right? So it's in August of 1969 when he has the folk singer Odetta appear on the show. This is August of 1969. It's broadcast just after the Woodstock Music and Arts Festival has happened in upstate New York and has dominated the nation's headlines, right? And Cash introduces Odetta as his featured guest, the main guest of this particular episode. And when she comes out, the camera pans to her standing alone on a moody, kind of ominous-looking set, looking out in the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee, where the thing was recorded before a live audience, right? Singing to a mostly white Southern audience, some of whom are sitting in a balcony right in front of her that has a sign across it that names it the Confederate Gallery, right? A reference to Civil War veterans who once donated money to the Ryman, right? So we don't have any record of what she thought of this. She didn't ever recount the story of standing there, or any of the other black artists who ever appeared at the Grand Ole Opry or on Cash's show. But here, in the home of the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville's Ryman Auditorium, Odetta comes out looking almost like a Black Power spokeswoman, right, in the same kind of era. She's got her hair in a natural afro. She's wearing this long, colorful dress. And she performs, amazingly, this mashup of two songs, the most prominent of which is an obscure blues song called Black Woman, right? So that's worth pausing for a second, right? Here's Johnny Cash bringing Odetta, who's an artist widely known as a civil rights activist and artist, to Nashville, a city still struggling with racial segregation in 1969, to the, quote, mother church of country music, to sing a blues song called Black Woman, right, to an audience of almost entirely white Southerners. When Cash comes out to greet her after this unusual performance, right, he takes her hand and the lights come up, which is part of what you see here in this photograph. And the whole tenor of the show shifts from being serious, deep, dark blues to like a giddy, mutual appreciation party, you know? Like the two of them are just in love with each other, it seems. Cash tells Odetta that ever since he first heard her, when he bought her first album in 1954, he had wanted to sing a duet with her. So the orchestra starts playing, and the two of them, one a giant of American folk music and the other a giant of American country music, sing a song called Shame and Scandal, which is from her second record from 1957. And it's an old tune, actually, you may know, because it's about these two brothers, Dutch brothers in the Caribbean, who are in love with the same woman, right? And it's a kind of old folk song that had been played by lots of artists in the folk circles of, say, Greenwich Village in the early 60s. But to see it performed by Cash and Odetta, and you can find this on YouTube if you go look, with lyrics that were kind of difficult to follow, you might have thought that the scandal of the song had something to do with interracial relationships, right? And the two have so much fun singing together, it seems almost flirtatious. Whereas moments earlier, Odetta seemed so somber and almost like regal. Now she sings with Cash, and it's like the two of them are laughing through the song like a couple of kids on the back of the school bus, like nudging each other because they like each other, you know? As they reach the end of the song, Odetta kisses Cash on the cheek, and he practically falls over in delight, like slapping his knee, right? And the audience cheers. So I start the chapter with this story because the obvious takeaway from these 7 minutes of network television is that Cash meant for Odetta's slot to be read as a rejection of racism and racial segregation in Nashville and in the United States, right? The interesting thing is that she had put out no new records recently, right, before this appearance. So she didn't have the usual reason to be out touring and performing on national television shows. Cash sought her out simply because he admired her, had been in love with her music, and he wanted to put that voice, her voice, both music and political, before the American public on its biggest and most inescapable stage, the American television set. In the short time that the show had been on the air, Cash had had a couple of other black artists on, the soul singers Joe Tex and O.C. Smith, and he could have continued with these kind of more benign guests, right? But he had established a list of like dream guests that he wanted with the network, and some of whom he had to fight for, like Pete Seeger later, because Seeger had had politics that the network found questionable. But he makes a big deal to get Odetta on in this first season, right, when he's hoping to get another season, so it's a little bit of a risk. So how Cash came to be sitting next to Odetta, holding hands, as you see in this photo, that night in 1969 is a complicated story. It follows Cash out of the shadows of Arkansas racism, where he grew up in Arkansas, as I'll describe, came from, highly segregated and racist part of the state, through the Air Force, where he served in Germany, and then through Memphis, to writing an overlooked civil rights album, and to promoting black creative genius on his television show, right? That story, I argue, and for me, this is kind of the heartbeat of this book project, and also has gotten the most criticism, so that's why I refuse to stop talking about it. That story is crucial to understanding how he would emerge as a spokesman for the underdog, whether they're African Americans, Native peoples, prisoners, or servicemen in Vietnam, or even opponents of the Vietnam War, right? He didn't come to this position overnight. He didn't choose it because he wanted to be more popular or something. It just comes as his commitment to public citizenship deepened, and he followed no script, right? And part of the script is problematic, as I'll describe. He's not always the kind of hero I at least want him to be, or other people want him to be. So that's the story I'm going to try to tell after a kind of long wind-up. You're going to keep me on time, right? All right. If I rush at the end, it's because I didn't plan well, but we don't have to talk about that now. I'll see how I do it. So if you know anything about even the vaguest outlines of Cash's life story, you know that, even if you've only seen the Joaquin Phoenix version, Walk the Line, which is pretty poor history, I might point out. You know that Cash grew up in northeast Arkansas, just up the Mississippi River from Memphis in a town called Dyess, or Dyess, as the people from Dyess say. They moved there in 1935, his family, when Johnny, or J.R. Cash, as he was called at the time, was just 3 years old, as part of a government program set up to, as part of Roosevelt's New Deal program, set up to relocate poor, landless farmers to what they called colonies in different parts of the country, mostly in the American South and Midwest. As you might imagine, northeast Arkansas was little different than the rest of the segregated South in its enforcement of racial apartheid. And although some administrators in Washington favored civil rights, they did not dare challenge the local culture when they set up these colonies. So none of the colonies that were set up were interracial. The vast majority of them were whites only. There were a couple of blacks only colonies, but they were not well supported. And Dyess was expressly built for white farmers. There were not even the usual segregated town signs that said whites only or colored only, because everybody knew this place was just for whites only, right? As a boy, growing up in this house, which is now kind of a historic home that you can go visit if you ever find yourself near Memphis, Tennessee. It's about 45 minutes from there. I would recommend checking it out. But Cash, growing up there, would have seen scenes like this along the roads to Dyess, and later in life talked about seeing farmers pushed out of their farms, a lot of them because they were tied to the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which a lot of the big local planters who were the rich guys in the area obviously didn't like, and terrorized the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And Cash often talked about seeing scenes like this of chain gangs working on the levees along the Mississippi River, right? Dyess is in Mississippi County, Arkansas, so it borders the Mississippi River in an area that used to historically be flooded quite often, and was the reason why cotton grew so well there when they first established the colonies there, because the silt from the river had made the ground really fertile. And in Arkansas, by the way, this photo was taken by, I think, Alan Lomax, the folklorist, sometime between 1934 and 1950. Chain gangs still existed in Arkansas into the 1950s, right? It wasn't uncommon to see them, especially working on the roads. So Cash, told stories about this, and although he didn't talk about it too much again until he got on his television show, people in the community talked all the time in retrospect about how racist the whole area was, right? And the last lynching that happened in Arkansas happened in the town next to Dyess in 1936, right? The best evidence we have of Cash's own racism came in letters that he wrote when he was in the Air Force, written back home to his sweetheart, Vivian Liberto, who he later married, that's his first wife, and that she published in a book in 2008. The language used in those letters is too offensive to be repeated aloud, but in each case, it seems what happened was that Airman Johnny Cash, or J.R. Cash as he was still known, got into a couple of near fights with African-American servicemen, usually guys from the Army. There was always this kind of rivalry between the Army and Air Force in Landsberg, Germany, usually when they were off base getting drunk, in Munich or Augsburg or someplace like that. And what's important is to understand the journey that Cash is going to take over the next 20 years is just how casually he uses the N-word and other racial epithets to describe these other African-American servicemen in the letters, and the kind of unashamed manner in which he reported it to his girlfriend back home in the cold light of day, right? That suggests just how deeply ingrained his racist attitudes were. So the question is, how does Cash, in the years that followed, shed that racism that he carried with him from Arkansas into the Air Force? And part of the answer, there's two parts of the answer really, but part of the answer is the change of scenery that comes after the Air Force, as I'll talk about, when Cash moved to Memphis. And as I explain throughout the book, the basis for Cash's social and political views almost always stemmed from the promptings of his own personal experience. And living in Memphis, as I'll talk about, changed Cash. But the other part of the answer to how he made this change over time has to do with folk music, and especially the music of John and Alan Lomax. This, I mentioned one of the Lomaxes took this photo, right? Who'd been collecting authentic, quote unquote, authentic folk music in field recordings from all over the South, dating from the 1930s, right? And then the last part of the answer has to do with the historical moment in which Cash found himself as a Southern artist who first recorded on an independent Southern label, Sun Records, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement in the mid and late 1950s, right? Indeed, when Cash arrived in Memphis in 1954, a new generation of civil rights leaders was emerging, leading desegregation fights on a number of fronts, including in Memphis, right? But most important is that Cash, right, he's got very little skills when he gets out of the Air Force. He had been a radio intercept officer, like listening to radio transmissions from the Soviet Union. He comes back and he becomes a door-to-door salesman of, refrigerators and dishwashers and stuff like that. And being the new guy, he gets assigned to the poorest neighborhoods, like the neighborhoods where people don't have much money to buy appliances and who mostly tend to be African American. And Cash had never worked any time before this in a place where in the course of a day he encountered only black people, right, until he moved to Memphis. And he began to see, and he wrote about this later, shared experiences in his poor upbringing and in the upbringing of black folks, right, in Memphis. They listened to the same radio station, it turned out, a pioneering Memphis radio station called WDIA, where B.B. King, the later famous blues guitarist, had started out as a DJ, as well as another radio station out of West Memphis, Arkansas, which played at the time what was mostly called race records, right? Because the records were pitched only to a black audience. And crucially, one day, as he went house to house trying to sell appliances to people who couldn't afford them, he came across an old man playing a banjo on his front porch. Well, the old man was not any old man. He was a virtuoso musician named Gus Cannon, who'd recorded some of the earliest country music recordings at the same time in the late 20s when the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers first recorded their, like, what are supposed to be the big bang of country music records in 1927. So Cash starts realizing he's kind of a lousy salesman, starts making a habit of ending all of his days on Gus Cannon's porch and brings his guitar so he can pick along and sing with him, but mostly just to kind of bask in the wisdom and experience of this legend time had forgotten. So in Memphis, Cash is spending a lot of time with African Americans for the first time, listening to a lot of African American music, especially gospel and blues, spending his money, as he said when he was many years later inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, spent almost all of his money at a record store in Memphis called the Home of the Blues, about which he later wrote a song, in fact, for Sun Records. And at the same time, making his own music at Sun with a bunch of other working class white guys who shared the same passion for black music, right? He not only loved Odetta, but he always said that his favorite singer was the sister Rosetta Tharpe. But he also listened to Howlin' Wolf and Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters and Pink Anderson. These were all people he writes about later. And around the time that he moves from Sun Records in the late 50s to Columbia Records, which was 1958, he had discovered some of these folk music albums that the Lomaxes had made, right? And particularly their historic recordings of Leadbelly, right? His name was Huddy Ledbetter, but everybody called him Leadbelly. But the most important records, the things that he repeatedly cited year after year after year in interviews as being the most influential, were these records here. Blues in the Mississippi Night, especially, is one of the most important records in his whole life, as well as this Southern Heritage Folk series, which came out the following year, 1959. These are the records he talked about the most and about the influence that they had on them. I could spend hours talking to you just about Blues in the Mississippi Night. If you don't know it, I recommend getting it, and I really recommend getting it on vinyl, so you get the full experience of the vinyl. There's multiple CD versions that came out, kind of expanded upon and stuff. They don't possess the kind of power. But Blues in the Mississippi Night bears witness to a deeply ingrained culture of racial coercion and violence in America. The original cover image, which is this image of the riverboat cruising at dusk, is almost ghostly, as you can see. And Alan Lomax, the folklorist who recorded them, called them authentic field recordings of three blues musicians who throughout the record kind of speak freely and then interject like a song or two along the way, right? But speaking freely and kind of spontaneously, like in a casual conversation on the porch about the origins of the blues and illustrating their points with these snippets of songs, right? Most of the album is a matter-of-fact indictment of the culture of white supremacy in the United States. Like imagine that in 1958, right? A record like this coming out. In my opinion, it's one of the most explosive American recordings ever produced. And it was so dangerous that when the three artists, who were Memphis Slim and Big Bill Brunzi and Sonny Boy Williamson, when they heard it and they heard that Lomax wanted to put the songs out with their kind of casual, unprompted speaking, they refused to have their names associated with it, because although they all lived in northern cities, they feared for the violence that might be visited on their families. So Lomax agreed to change their names to pseudonyms, Leroy, Natchez, and Sib. And only when he did that did they say, okay, you can put the record out. Nobody knows who we are speaking, right? For Johnny Cash, the appeal of this record lays in the authenticity of the three men's voices and the delivery of their stories. Leroy and Natchez in the first side trade first and second-hand stories of racial abuse, violence, and murder. It becomes clear as they speak that they've been in prison themselves. They've worked on chain gangs. They've been in levee camps working along the Mississippi. They talk about being ripped off by the levee camp bosses, ripped off by the company store, being trapped in debt so that they can't get out of the work, being cheated out of earnings because the planters did all the weighing and the figuring, they said, all the math, right? And a black man, they said, didn't mean more to a white man than a mule. So if one died, they'd just get another, they said, right? In the most shocking tale on the album, which has a lot of shocking stories in it, Natchez recounts the story of his own uncle being lynched, right? Because it starts when his sharecropper uncle beat up a planter, so a white boss, who demanded that the uncle's pregnant wife work in the fields, right? And of course the guy was like, no, she's like 8 months pregnant, she's not working. And they get into a fight and he beats him up. When the posse of racists comes to get Natchez, Natchez's uncle, he shoots at least 4 of them, right? and then flees, and he and his family get away, but not for long. Eventually, a much larger mob of 50 or 60 men track him down and hang him from a tree, all because he didn't want his wife to work out on the plantation, right? At this point, the three of them begin playing a song that at the time was very obscure called Another Man Done Gone, which I'll talk about again in a bit later. So although the three men at times described the blues as a kind of revenge, because within the songs you could be singing in code so that the person singing could say things about the boss that they couldn't otherwise get away with, Leroy summarizes that the blues grows out of your experience, right? And the things you want to do or want to know. It comes from things that have really happened to you. That's really important to Cash. That seems like the most important insight of the whole record, because Cash's public citizenship over the next decade becomes an extension of this understanding of the blues, coming from your own experience. His empathy originates, like the blues, with his own experience, where he didn't bear witness personally, he researched his subjects so that he could more authentically capture that experience, right? He wrote he responded to a journalist in the 1960s that he wanted to create space for, quote, voices that weren't commonly heard at the time, voices that were ignored or even suppressed in the entertainment media. So what he's talking about is wanting to make folk records, right? That's what folk artists always did. So Cash starts moving towards this social realism that he admired in Leadbelly and in the Lomax recordings and in Odetta, right, more deliberately in the 1960s. He has a series of concept albums in the 1960s, Ride This Train, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and Bitter Tears, which he said he simply aimed to document American life, right? That's a little bit of a lie, because he's not only interested in documenting American life, he's interested in like proving a point, right? So I'll start with Ride This Train. How am I doing?
Pick up the speed of the train.
I'm going to get this train moving out of the station. I want to get to blues. I want to get to Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So I'll just say that this album for me is problematic, right? And it's because it's recorded in 1960, in early 1960. And on the one hand, it has this version of a song called Goin' to Memphis that he gets songwriting credit for, but where most of the song lyrics he lifted from Blues in the Mississippi Night. He takes it from the dialogue, right? But then, shockingly, after he does this great version of Going to Memphis that seems to provide like a little bit of insight into the lives of somebody working on a levee camp, for example, he then recorded this song called Boss Jack, which is effectively a song about a kindly white enslaver, right? A slave master, who talks about how back in the day, before the Civil War, he earned bumper crops, cotton and stuff, and he was one of the biggest cotton farmers in the area, and that he had all these slaves who really loved him, and that even after the Civil War, many of them agreed to stay and continue working for him, right? It's completely tone deaf, right, for the historical moment in which he's recording this song. In fact, he records it basically a week after the sit-ins began at lunch counters in Nashville. He's on like one side of town while people are protesting segregation at the lunch counters and the department stores in Nashville on the other side of town. This, to some people is totally unforgivable, and I get that because it's really frustrating to me. Like when I'm doing the research and coming through all of the albums and getting to him writing these songs about the Black experience, I'm thinking, okay, so he gets it. He's sort of on the side of civil rights, even if he's not actively like waving the flag or marching in protests, right? But then he records this awful song, which is not his song, it's a Tex Ritter song, but still, he seems a little clueless, right? But then sometime between 1960 and 1962, Cash's views on race become much more consistent and sharper. And it's not totally clear why that happens, other than perhaps because the civil rights movement is dominating the headlines, as I was saying. And perhaps as a Southerner, he's trying to confront, his own people's place in the wretched legacy of white supremacy. But by 1962, he decides to, and this is where the train is leaving the station. I'm going to fast forward. Between July and August of 1962, Cash records a batch of songs for this album called Blood, Sweat, and Tears that most people regard primarily as an album of songs about working people. But Blood, Sweat, and Tears is a concept album about race in America. It's about the violent enforcement of racial hierarchies, and it's perhaps one great record made in support of Black lives by a country music star, even if almost everyone missed it at the time, right? To be fair, like when we think about a civil rights album, you think about Odetta, or you think about Pete Seeger performing at Carnegie Hall and bringing these songs from the civil rights movement to New York City, right, as a way to galvanize people to support the civil rights movement. So Seeger's famous Carnegie Hall album includes Ain't Scared of Your Jail and Eyes on the Prize and If You Meet Me on the Back of the Bus. If Cash had just recorded some of those songs, it would have been easier to identify him as a civil rights activist artist. But that's not what he chose to do. Instead, he records these songs not to inspire activists, but to confront his mostly white listeners with the shocking, documented brutality that their silence made possible, right? His civil rights work, if we can call it that, is complementary. He's the social realist documenting it as a witness, right? This is also an album I think you should go buy in vinyl. You go listen to it just as he listened to it, or made it, side one and side two. Because side one of Blood, Sweat, and Tears possesses such cumulative power rooted in violence that it's hard to listen to it twice in a row. And flipping it over to the other side doesn't give you much relief, but it's a little bit. Side one has 3 songs, that's all. The Legend of John Henry's Hammer, Tell Him I'm Gone, and Another Man Done Gone. These are all songs that the Lomaxes has recorded in the field by Leadbelly and other artists before this time. John Henry becomes a really famous part of Cash's repertoire. He performs it for the rest of his life, a very long version, like 8 minutes of it, that was always a hit at his concerts. And although there's some, debate at the time about nobody knows who John Henry's identity is, it's not really true. Like, we know for sure who John Henry was. He was a black prisoner in Virginia. That's all been documented at this point. But even by the 1930s, when the Legend of John Henry's Hammer was showing up in song, or in song books, right, that are in the Library of Congress, they're illustrated with a black prisoner. Like, Cash knows when he records the song that this is about a black man swinging a sledgehammer and beating a steam drill, right, in digging a tunnel in Virginia, and then dying, right? So it's partly about a man being worked to death, a black man being worked to death, right, against this new technology. It's followed by Tell Him I'm Gone, which is a rewritten version of a Leadbelly song called Take This Hammer. And in the Leadbelly song, it's a pretty straightforward song. It's the tale of a man saying to another guy on the chain gang, take this hammer, because he's fleeing, he's gonna run, right? And tell the captain of the chain gang that I'm gone. He doesn't say much about why he's leaving, except that the work hurts his pride, right? Odetta later records this song, and then Cash records it too, right? And in each case, they both add to the lyrics so that they become a little bit more explicit, right, about the violence that's being done to the man who's handing the hammer off and taking off, right? And Cash, in particular, in his version, makes it seem even crazy that the guy's going. Like, the guy has almost lost his mind because he knows that they're going to be coming after him with hounds, and they're going to be carrying a 99 caliber gun, which is a big gun, that Cash lets out this kind of crazed woo sound I can't begin to imitate. Like he knows that the guy, the narrator, is risking his life, right? So taken together, the new lyrics describe an overseer who, as Cash said in Going to Memphis, whips convicts like mules, taunts them with names, and has the capacity, thanks to this big gun, to kill them, right? And as the saying went, one dies, you get another. But Another Man Done Gone is the highlight of the record for me, not like you look forward to listening to it, but it's the heart of the album. It's the third and final song on side one, and it tells us what happened to the convict in Tell Him I'm Gone, the guy who fled the chain gang. The Lomaxes first recorded this song. The very first documentation of the song we have is from the 1940s, when it was sung by Vera Hall, who was a dishwasher living in Livingston, Alabama. And unlike Tell Him I'm Gone, which is narrated by the convict, Another Man Done Gone is told from the perspective of a witness to a crime involving the convict, right? In Vera Hall's first version, the person who committed the new crime is the convict himself, right? She talks about how he fled from a county farm, that's a prison farm. He had a long chain on, and that, quote, she sings, he killed another man, right? So it's a killer who's fleeing a chain gang, he killed another man, right? When Odetta records it in 1957, and subsequent recordings by Leon Bibb and Johnny Cash, it's changed to they killed another man. So this time the convict is the one being chased and killed, right? The man done gone is the convict who's been killed, right? Leon Bibb, who's a less well-known folk singer but was a mentor to Odetta, wrote in a new line about they hunted him with hounds, right? So Cash, perhaps taking inspiration from Bibb for rewriting the song, adds his own lyrics, and he sings it almost entirely a cappella with Anita Carter of the Carter family singing like on a falsetto in recall response, right? So in Cash's telling, he doesn't mention the hounds. He skips right from he had a long chain on to they hung him in a tree. And worse than that, quote, they let his children see, right? These are Cash's lines, and in the recording, he alone sings them. It's like Anita Carter's voice is so pure and perfect, it can't bear the weight of this violence, of this lynching, right? But even here, Cash is not satisfied that his white listeners are going to fully understand what he seems to have grasped, perhaps from his Arkansas boyhood, maybe from family stories, because we know that his uncle was a Klansman in Arkansas, right? About the repulsive evils of lynching. So Cash sings in his lowest register, quote, when he was hanging dead, the captain turned his head. The captain turned his head, right? The scene of this man's lynching is so awful in front of his family that even the captain, the man who's leading the lynch mob, can't bear to look at it, right? Obviously, Johnny Cash is not here looking for a hit single to be played on the radio. He's aiming to turn our stomachs, right? And not gratuitously, because he recorded it in the summer of 1962 when violence lurked everywhere, right? Just months after he releases this song, a Klansman named Byron Della Beckwith shoots down the NAACP organizer Medgar Evers in his driveway, also in front of his wife and children, right? So the song punctuates side one like an exclamation point and makes Blood, Sweat, and Tears a kind of landmark achievement in the contemplation of race by a country artist, even if Columbia Records, this major record label based in New York, didn't market it that way, right? And we don't know why. I've tried to get through the records of Columbia Records and other people who were participating in the making of the record, and no one can explain why they didn't market it as a record about race, right? But Cash later said, I was trying to write about history so that people could understand what was going on, right? So partly it's his own experience, partly it's the historical moment in which he is creating this art that drive him to write this album, right? The record ends up peaking at number 80 on the country charts, and then Cash pretty much turns the page and starts working on his next album, which is called Bitter Tears, and that's all about the violence visited upon Native Americans in a 1965 album. Cash did do some other songs that are related to race that came out across albums in the 1960s, but also were not specifically marketed or pitched as songs about race. But when he gets to the television show in 1969, then he's much more deliberate about how he presents his support for civil rights, even though, frustratingly, he still seems like he's an old Southern white boy who has feelings in his heart for the Confederacy, right? Even on the episode with Odetta, right? He has this very moving moment at the beginning of the episode. Later in the episode, he does this segment called Ride This Train, which is based on that record album, where he takes viewers through to some historical moment in the past. He goes to all of these Civil War sites, right? And he basically gives a kind of pacifist argument about how the violence of war, that nobody wins in a war, right? That the victors are losers because they fought a war that both sides had to lose no matter which side won, he said, right? That can only leave bitter feelings, broken bodies, and a wounded nation that only time will heal. Obviously, he's also talking about the Vietnam War, right, in 1969 when he's making these generalizations about war. But then, frustratingly, he says at the end, you know what, folks? I always was for the underdog, which makes you wonder if he's for the Viet Cong. But in the case of the Civil War, you just got to know whose side I'd be on. And then he sings this song called Johnny Reb, which is a kind of tribute to Confederate soldiers, right, about the lost cause. And one has to wonder, although I have never found any evidence about it, what Odetta off stage is thinking about this performance, right? But what might seem strange to us or to the viewers on television clearly didn't seem strange to him, because it wasn't about him making a stand on a particular issue or not, right? That it was all about feeling. It's just how he felt, right? How he felt about black people shows up in the making of Blood, Sweat, and Tears and in his engagement with artists on his show, but he also clearly feels an identity that remains close to this problematic history of the American South, right? I'll just finish, is that a good idea? With this one segment of Ride This Train, right? He did another segment later in April of 1970 where he reenacts the Levee Camp stories of Blues in the Mississippi Night. And he speaks in character as if he's a prisoner, right, in this Levee Camp. And he tells the stories about the boss whipping convicts. He says the prison warden promised the walking boss that if he shot 2 escapees, he'd get his own parole. And he goes on to sing Going to Memphis, right, which is clearly about the identity of a black man, right, who says that he can't get to Tennessee with Mississippi all over his face. And he goes on to mention dogs chasing a guy down, people being whipped into a blistering sun, right? And then he says at the end, you'd think things like this don't happen in this country now. Well, it does, right? And still in character, he describes 6 prisoners who'd simply reached the limit of what they could tolerate. Using a 10-pound hammer, they break each other's legs, right? Now, this is before a live audience. There's total silence, right, in the Ryman Auditorium. They got out of the work all right, he said, but now they're in the hole on bread and water, and God, at night you can hear them moan. And then he says, it's almost enough to make a man give a damn, right? As if his gruesome depiction of these desperate men maiming each other wasn't enough, he seemed to hold the audience responsible for turning a blind eye. And this is at a moment where he's kind of merging his work on race with prison reform, right? He's been performing in a lot of prisons. He's most famous because of the 2 prison albums at Folsom and San Quentin, but he's accusing his own viewing audience and the audience right there in the theater with him of apathy, right? And so I guess that's a good place to stop. It's the upshot is that in the end, he also makes the show a kind of vehicle for interracial harmony. And he has guests like Ray Charles and Charlie Pride and Louis Armstrong and all kinds of other African-American artists, you know, from Stevie Wonder to Joe Tex and the staple singers who appear on the show, really relating to them as equals, right? In a time when this was highly unusual, right? It was highly unusual for a white star like this to have a television show where he brings all these black artists on who he obviously reveres, right? And it's not a kind of tokenism, right? He's not doing this for ratings or anything. He's doing it because it's what he likes. Later, he's going to keep doing other stuff that he likes, like talking about his faith that's going to ultimately get the show canceled. But the vision of equality that he presents on the show is kind of a model for the rest of the nation and demonstrates the personal journey that somebody who starts out with racist origins could make. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So we pushed him through at high speed so that we could have a conversation. And this is being live streamed and recorded. So please wait until Annalise arrives with the microphone before asking your questions. Don't all jump at once. Come on. Take a breath and a drink.
Yalta.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Yalta.
Good to see you again. I know you know this song, right? There's this song that he records in somewhere in the mid-'60s, Johnny Cash. And by the way, thanks for this great talk.
Sure.
What is it called? The one on the left's on the right?
Yeah.
Or the one on the right's on the left, right?
Yeah.
With the tagline that goes like, don't mix music and politics or whatever.
Yeah.
I always thought that was sort of that sort of summed up Johnny Cash, right? But I'm kind of wondering if you can expand a little. Is the problem that a lot of scholars have with Johnny Cash that they want to, like you mentioned, look at him as party affiliated, like so the left as the progressives and the right as the conservatives, and he kind of defies all of that.
Yeah.
And that's why he can sing a song like that and still hold political views, because it's not about political party for him.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, so if you know this song, it's called The One on the Right is on the Left, right? And it's a song that was written by Shel Silverstein, who's is that right? Is it Shel Silverstein or Jack Clemens? Now I get them mixed up. It's one of these two kind of country music humorists, right? And it's a song that makes fun of folk singers, right? It makes fun of folk singers who take political stands, right? And so Cash records it, and it's on an album that's made up of a bunch of humorous songs that comes out in the period where he's really suffering through his drug abuse trials, you know, a 7-year period. And he performs it twice on the Johnny Cash show, in fact. And this is the best guess I have to respond to your question, is that I think on the one hand, like Cash sees the song as, you know, this kind of political categorizing thing that he clearly had a problem with, right? He does at times support political candidates, but from both parties, right? He supports Winthrop Rockefeller, who's the governor of Arkansas, because he's got a real serious prison reform program. He later supports Jimmy Carter, for example, in the 76 election. And other candidates too, although he does it kind of quietly. But also he liked really funny songs, right? And like his biggest hit, I think ever, is A Boy Named Sue, which is the Shel Silverstein song, right? And it's kind of in the same vein, right, of like taking a folk music form and then making a parody of it, right? So when he performs it on the Johnny Cash show, he makes the Tennessee Three, his band, dress in like exaggerated hippie costumes, you know, with big flowers on their lapels, and they look really goofy, and he just makes fun of them because they're a bunch of straight white Southern guys who are definitely not hippies, right? Who he dresses up to look like whatever the caricature is of a 60s folk group, you know? But I do think it's right that a lot of people read his recording of that song as somehow all you need to know about his politics. And I think it's okay for a guy to be really serious about politics the way most of us are about how we feel about things, and to also kind of mock, you know, the whole genre. And yeah, anyway, I do talk about that song in the book and about the performances of it, because I think the performances are crucial. Nobody really bought that album. It's called Everybody Loves a Nut. It's not good, you know. It's got like "You Dirty Old Egg-Sucking Dog" on it. These are not like the best songs that Johnny Cash ever recorded.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, can we still view Cash as an all-American hero now after your book, or is that the end of it?
Well, yeah, so that's subject to debate. Yeah, and like I didn't set out to present him as an American hero necessarily. I wanted to present him as a citizen artist or an artist citizen in a way that he hadn't been appreciated for before. But then, as like I alluded, there's been some debate since I published the book, and particularly about this chapter on race, where it's clear that certain reviewers think like there's just no redeeming him, because the letters that he wrote back to his girlfriend at the time were so awful, right, that he couldn't have actually changed in this way, right? And the implication is that he somehow did it as a calculated career move or something. But there isn't a shred of evidence that that's true. Like, and his manager's papers are available in a university library. There isn't any evidence anywhere from anyone in his camp that he was like somehow inauthentic, you know? So I don't know if I'd go so far as to say he's an American hero. I guess that's a very subjective subject, but I think he's a kind of model citizen for like, and a model that other, you know, people with a big platform, you know, could follow. Although, you know, in the age of social media, I'm sure he would not have survived, you know, because like one wrong statement and you're just shredded, right? And he had wrong statements, you know. Mark sits at the back.
How y'all doing? So, Mike, I was with the slides you have up here and the story you told about the influence of the blues on Johnny Cash. It reminded me of an album that came out recently, Hank Williams Jr., Rich White Honky Blues, where he sort of builds on the legend that his father started off as a blues musician, learned the blues, not too different from the story you told about Johnny Cash. And it just made me wonder, did Cash come out and say, you know, country is really the blues, or did he talk about the genealogy of country music? And does that also kind of shape the story that he's trying to tell, in a sense that he's kind of saying that blues and the country and gospel, that there really isn't this separation between them that the marketing has and racial politics has often encouraged?
Yeah, that's a great question, because he did talk about it. He recounted, you know, not so much in this period before the prison albums and before the TV show, but later, you know, he would talk about the influences on him, and especially about all the different radio stations. Like, this is kind of part of the Cash lore, is that the first good crop of cotton that his father got out of this 20 acres of land in Dyess, Arkansas, was enough that they could not only buy food for the family and shoes and stuff like that, but that his father sent away for this $5 Sears and Roebuck radio. And then Cash, like the standard image is that Cash spent all of his time listening to this radio, while his other siblings, who were harder workers, you know, earned the favor of their father. I think that's probably overstated, the role of the radio. But at the same time, he's quite specific about which radio stations he listened to, which radio shows, and which artists. And it covers the whole range, of white artists playing on the Grand Ole Opry, or the Louisiana Hayride and the Wheeling Jamboree, and also all these black artists. And later he did talk about how, trying to collect records, like race records, because that's how they were marketed, was only to black audiences, was a challenge. And he definitely couldn't do it in Arkansas. It was only Memphis that made that possible, where he could go to a record store that had both white and black records, Of course, there's like a bigger question here about co-optation, right? And it's the standard conversation that comes up anytime you talk about Elvis is ripping off black music, right? And presenting it to a white audience. And Sun Records, under the direction of Sam Phillips, was very deliberate about that. So you can start an argument pretty easily talking about the motives of Sam Phillips or Elvis or even Cash, right, in recording these songs. I don't think there's much evidence that they were like deliberately trying to steal, from black artists. They were very much in reverence of the black artists. They didn't get why they weren't marketed to white audiences. And Sam Phillips figured out that, well, if I get white guys to sing it, then we can have this great music become more widespread. It's a fine line, obviously, because then they profit immensely from the music of artists who don't profit, in the same way, whose, work is effectively exploited. And that's, a lingering sore spot for a lot of people for good reason, There's one here. Yeah, okay.
I thoroughly enjoyed your book on the Dead Kennedys, by the way. So I'm kind of wondering what Johnny Cash's standing was in the political punk culture of San Francisco that you described in the book.
Yeah. So Dead Kennedys, if you don't know, were this very political band that came out of San Francisco in the late 1970s. Their first album came out in 1980. And there's a two-part answer to your question. The first part is that at the time, in 1980, punks would have regarded Johnny Cash as like the worst, right? Because he was just this big shot celebrity who didn't have a show anymore, but he was on television every Christmas with like a family Christmas special, He kind of represented the height of like straight, old-fashioned America, And they didn't like that, right? Like that's part of what the punks were fighting against, is this kind of conformist culture, right? And that country music and Cash certainly would have been seen as part of that. Later, after Cash does all the American Recordings albums in the 1990s, and Rick Rubin, the producer, kind of focuses on the badass image of Cash, the outlaw image, and a whole new audience finds Cash for the first time. Now, all of a sudden, all these punks were like, oh yeah, I always loved Johnny Cash, Like he was the exception of country music, As they were all old enough, if you were a punk in San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles or wherever in the late 70s, early 80s, you were old enough to have seen his television show. And a lot of people like that age, I'm thankfully too young to have ever seen the television show when it was on, but my older siblings all talked about how they tuned in. They didn't care about Tammy Wynette or Loretta Lynn, but they loved it that like Derek and the Dominoes and the Guess Who and Stevie Wonder and artists like that were on the Cash show, So there is something like retrospectively they can go back to and say, oh yeah, that was such a cool show and he was always the best, right? But that is not what they were saying in 1980, yeah.
Hello. Do you know of any examples that Cash was getting criticized by his original fans when he got so outspoken for the black community and black rights? Or was it quite easily accepted, his views.
I mean, he does get criticism. I had to skip over this because I was being rushed through my talk. He gets a lot of criticism from a lot of racists, in the South. Like at one point in 1965, he gets arrested at the border where he's trying to smuggle a lot of pills in his guitar, right? He has a court date a month later, and his wife accompanies him with his lawyer, and then there's a famous, very grainy photograph that goes out on the wire to newspapers all over the country. She was a very dark-skinned Italian-American, but the National States Rights Party, which is like a offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan, spots her as being black and then accuses Cash of promoting interracial relationships and whatever their usual arguments were about like destroying the purity of the white race, yada yada. This is like a hopelessly ineffective organization, right? So they don't make a lot of headway, but they do make threats on his life. They picket at some of his concerts. It's enough of a problem that his lawyer has to fight back and kind of threaten a lawsuit, right? Which is also problematic for a variety of reasons. And then it turns out Roseanne Cash went on a television show in the last couple of years, a public television show in the United States, and it turns out her DNA shows up that her mother did in fact have African American blood, like way distant in the bloodline, so that's sort of like, to the Klan. But other than that, no. And I think the reason he didn't get much criticism for it was because he wasn't so vocal about it until the TV show, and even then, he's not vocal about supporting civil rights or black power. He's just kind of, modeling a kind of interracial harmony that more and more the country can get behind, But yeah, he got much more criticism for his complicated views on the Vietnam War, for example, than he did about race or about Native Americans,
Hi, Mike. Thanks for your talk. I think I'm trying to point out a parallel I might be seeing.
Okay.
And perhaps you can respond to it, and maybe I can figure it out while I talk. It seems to me that you mentioned this this problem of polarization, right? It was then, it was now. I now feel like the nuance that is needed to understand someone like Johnny Cash and his politics is exactly something you might need in these ages of polarity. Is there sort of a parallel there with how he was received back then, and how do you perhaps see your own book functioning in that way now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a parallel, for sure. And my dream for the book was that it would somehow, transform American culture. It's not going very well. Turns out you can spend many years working on a book and nobody reads it. But, people read it. Like, it sold more than any other books I wrote. But primarily because it's got Johnny Cash's face on the front of it, I think. But yeah, I do think like our own times clearly require an attention to nuance and complexity in our political experience that you don't see in the media, right? And you don't see it in political discourse. And there are artists, who still kind of navigate this, but are also not as vocal as I at least wish they would be, There are some artists who are clearly loved by everybody across the political spectrum, like Dolly Parton, right? But then, I don't know if you've ever listened to this podcast on Dolly Parton called Dolly Parton's America, but it's really worth listening to because she's really complicated as Cash is to kind of unpack her political views. And she does come down very clearly with some stands, but then somehow the people who oppose those stands still find a way to love her, in a way that was similar for Cash's audience, And similarly, like with Willie Nelson, except he's even more clearly, a left-wing guy who somehow has a pretty vast right-wing audience, of people who come to Farm Aid concerts every year and are surprised that, they're out of place, or they're made to feel like they're out of place because they you know, or so they're wearing MAGA hats or something like that, you know. But yeah, so I don't know the answer to how we make it happen. Like, this was my apparently not strong enough effort to try to influence that discussion. But, and anytime I talk about it and you say, well, people are complex and they have, you know, political views that are complicated, and I can cite all these political science studies and sociology studies that back all of this up, right? That it doesn't matter to most people whether they fit into a category, right? It just matters if it makes sense in their own mind. That's how most of us are, unless you're like a really committed ideologue, you know? So there's always like nods of like, yes, recognition, like that's a real thing in American life, but it doesn't translate for some reason into the, you know, the media, which is obviously a commercial product that needs to sell in a certain way, and apparently, you know, keeping the public convinced that we're the most polarized we've ever been sells papers, right? And sells sponsorships on television networks, you know? So.
I have a follow-up to that. So it's been 2 decades since Cash died, and in 2004 there was sort of use by his image and his music by the Republican Party, and then fans jumping in saying this doesn't represent him and so forth. And you know, certainly yours is in a string of books about Cash. What do you imagine his legacy is now? Do you think that this idea of him as a Southern boy still sort of dominates his public image, or do you think that there's been a sort of nuancing that you've been putting forth in the public? I know you did, at the time the book came out, still sort of the end of the COVID era, you did some online things. What were the kinds of questions people asked in terms of that sort of representation of who he is today?
Yeah, I mean, like the incident you're referring to is in the 2004 Republican convention, the Tennessee delegation of Republicans had a special event at Sotheby's, the auction house, because the auction house was preparing to sell off the Cash and June Carter estate, right? And this became very politicized as both sides tried to claim him, right? And then the family came out and said, you know, this is not what we wanted, and we are not saying that Johnny Cash is a Republican. We in fact oppose their use of his image. We just thought, because the one senator from Tennessee was an old family friend, that it was okay to have a party, you know. So we're not saying this is political. And then in Charlottesville in 2017, where you had this right-wing riot, right, where a protester was killed, somebody was seen wearing a Johnny Cash t-shirt. One of these racists was wearing a Johnny Cash t-shirt. And again, the children come out and say, like, in no way does Johnny Cash, are we prepared to tolerate Johnny Cash's association with this racist right-wing stuff, right? The guy was about love, not about hate, et cetera, right? So I think perhaps, but it would be difficult to measure. Like, I would like to see a study done where you kind of measure what people's views of Cash are now, but I think perhaps because of those interventions by the family, putting people on notice that this is not the stuff that Cash stood for, that there's a general recognition that he's more complicated than that. But, you know, like I say, I think you can start a good argument between people who are ideologues who want to claim him for this reason or that reason. You know, some who see him as a good old boy, Southern boy, and some who see him as, you know, a radical who played at prisons, you know, and swore on a record and was, you know, didn't seem to be, he wasn't interested in the law and order regime of Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, right? But still, you know, I think it would not be difficult to start that argument, you know.
Hi, thanks for this talk. It was super interesting. One thing that I keep coming back to is whenever you talk about what Cash himself says about his politics, it's almost a kind of non-politics. It's like very articulate not to be political. So basically your book, or the way in which you've talked about him today, was more about his actions and like what he was actually doing, which is interesting because I think the fact that he never was so outspokenly political also makes him easier to claim. But then I imagine it's also pretty hard to write about the politics of a man who explicitly says he's non-political.
Yeah.
Which I think in a way also says something about your definition of politics, maybe.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very astute observation. He's exactly right. Like, he never makes a statement where he suggests even that he's a political thinker, right? So he's not in any way on record or on television or in interviews trying to, like, stick his nose into some political issue, right? It's like he's either being asked about something, and so he, especially after the prison albums and he has the television show, he gets a lot of questions like this. There's a recording that set me on this path of writing this book without me realizing it over 20 years ago, because it was released in 2001. It's a 1969 concert at Madison Square Garden. It's a complete concert, right? And it was the first time, when I heard that album, it was the first time I'd ever heard him talk about the Vietnam War, right? And he talks about it from the stage of Madison Square Garden in ways that are complicated, right? But he says, I only started talking about this because people kept asking me about it, you know? So there's that part of it, is that he's not actually interested in running for office, which people wanted him to do. He's not interested in standing in for a political party. He's not trying to even suggest that he's a political thinker, really, right? But what comes across in the TV show, which is 57 episodes across 2.5 years, is a guy who's willing to let the public see that he doesn't have all the answers, that he's kind of struggling to figure stuff out, you know? This is particularly true with the Vietnam War, where at times he sounds like he's kind of supporting President Nixon's policies in Vietnam, and in other times he's clearly critical of the war and supportive of young people who are protesting against the war, right? So it's all very much like of the moment in which he's recording that particular television show and what he thinks at that moment. And he even said to a reporter who was frustrated that he couldn't like pigeonhole him, zero him down to one thing or another. He's like, don't ask me what I think about political issues. Like, if you don't like it, don't ask me, because what I say today may not be the same thing I say to you tomorrow, you know? And then, so to answer the second part of your question is, like, for me, as a historian, trying to make sense of his political experience and trying to think about, like, what counts as politics, right? And what counts as political engagement or political culture, I'm taking a much more expansive view than Fox News or MSNBC or whomever who want to like take a very narrow view of what a person's political experience is. And that's because in my experience, you know, as a citizen, that's how most of us operate, right? Like, most of us, you know, encounter an issue and we don't immediately like go to you know, I don't know, something that Milton Friedman wrote or Karl Marx wrote to figure it out. We try to figure it out based on like our own experiences and the information that we have at hand. And so the real value of his public citizenship wouldn't have been visible to anyone if not for the television show. And in that television show, like I say, he struggles with it. He's visibly struggling with trying to figure out how he feels about things. And at times, his views are not consistent from one broadcast to another. But to me, that's like probably the best example of political engagement, you know, is somebody who at least gives a shit, you know, who wants to like figure it out and is somehow unfiltered enough to want to do it in front of a big audience every week, you know. That to me is probably the most admirable thing about him. Because other people would have had managers going, oh God, no, you can't talk about race. You can't talk about the Vietnam War. You can't talk about God, right? And he was just like, I'm going to talk about whatever I want to talk about, you know.
I think we have time for one more question. A nice all-encompassing wrap-up kind of question. Anyone? Yeah.
Mike. Great talk.
Dirk Jan.
Hi. Well, you know, I'm a political historian, but still I want to question the political nature of the act of the stance that Johnny Cash takes. And shouldn't we value his acts? We've been looking at these two pictures for 15 minutes now. At this moment, wasn't this more an act of the necessary cultural engagement? And so it's showing the country that beyond the political antagonisms, they were a new kind of society was developing in the years after the Civil Rights Act, that is represented by these artists. And these artists, of course, what was beneficial to his aim was, of course, that these artists were even more popular than he was. But still, shouldn't we look at this as these moments, and maybe even at Blood, Sweat and Tears, as acts of cultural engagement rather than as political acts?
Yes, now you've picked a fight, Dirk Jan. Yeah, so I agree completely, right? That it's definitely cultural engagement, but what I'm saying is that cultural engagement can also be political engagement, right? And not to like boil it down and make it sound so simple, but you're absolutely right and the problem for me is that historians in the United States, when they examine this period, particularly this later post-war period, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the prevailing narrative is about how the United States emerges from all of the upheaval of the 1960s, right? And the kind of the age of great dreams is what one historian has called it, right? And then makes a sharp kind of right turn in the Reagan era, right? That's, to this day, that's been the narrative for like 30 years, right? And that's, to this day, the prevailing narrative. So if you watch any documentaries, you read any books about like the 70s, 80s, 90s, it's all about this political shift, but it's entirely dependent on examining the way Americans vote, as if voting is the only way that you can engage with politics, right? So what I and other scholars have been trying to do is shift or open up the discussion beyond like the traditional forms of political engagement, right? Of belonging to a political party, of voting a certain way, of even participating in a political movement that is very clearly, you know, a grassroots movement, so it's very clearly left or right wing, right? That it can include a television show or an album, you know, made by anybody, a folk artist or a superstar like Cash or Ray Charles, for example. That it can include all different forms, right? And that political culture is much bigger than just voting every 2 or 4 years. Like voting is important, right? But, you know, you could make a similar argument's been made about gay rights in the United States, right? That the most important thing that happened for gay rights was the television show Will and Grace, because it just normalized having like gay characters on TV, right? And so then no matter how much the Christian right pushes back against gay rights, they've already lost and they don't even know it. Like they can pass more legislation, but the country has culturally and also therefore politically moved on, right? And so that's the real value of examining, like as a historian, examining these kinds of sources that usually fall outside of the scope, at least of American historians who study this period, you know?
Okay, well, we have a little bit of business if you want to advance the slide.
I forgot that I had a list of songs that I used in this presentation, in case you want. Imagine if I tried to play each of these songs, we'd still be in the introduction. So I put them up in case you want to snap some photos and go buy some records. And I can tell the Cash estate that if they see an uptick in sales in the Netherlands, they should thank me for that. Yeah.
So we'll give you a minute to take snapshots of that, your listening guide for the next few days. And then we also have a slide from Studium Generale to give you the chance to influence what programs are coming next. So everything you'd like to know about maybe Farm Aid. And we could have Mike Foley come back in 6 months to give another talk. So we'll have a slide up in just a second with a QR code. Please, please, please cast your vote. This is your chance for political action.
There it is.
And to influence what we see in the coming months from Studium Generale. Thank you all so much for coming out on this lovely, lovely night. And thank you so much, Mike, for this great talk.
Thank you. Thanks very much.